there's been a lot of talk in.
Sorry, just move it across the other. No, wait.
There we go.
There we go.
There we go. There's been a lot of talk recently, and I think Dr. David Starkey, you can see on the screen at the moment, has been leading this charge. The fundamental thing that needs to happen in British politics is that there needs to be a wholesale reversal of Blair's revolution, Blair's silent, grinning revolution that took place in 1997. Much less overt and much more innocuous seeming than Cromwell's much more overtly violent, very po-faced revolution in the 17th century. And Starkey's been leading the charge on this front. The problem is that Blair's assault on the traditional constitution of the United Kingdom, which was based, as we know, on parliamentary sovereignty and a tradition of representative government, or at any rate maximally representative government, new social classes being admitted to that over time. You couldn't go mass democracy straight away, but in the 19th century, mass democracy kicks in. 20th century, mass democracy kicks in as well, broadening the franchise through which people can be represented. This wholesale revolution by Blair, rather than being challenged by the Conservative Party in the way that Thatcher, from 79 onwards, challenged the post-war consensus in a very self-conscious, intellectually, in a very self-conscious fashion with a huge amount of intellectual ballast. People like Keith Joseph at the Centre for Policy Studies was instrumental to that sort of counter-revolution which Thatcher considered herself as engaging in. The Conservatives have just completely accepted this new status quo, and since 2010, they're hopefully going to be punished for it. But the problem for us is that the worst, gents, seems to be yet to come, because what remains of our traditional constitution, because Blair didn't kill it off altogether, may yet now be killed off altogether by an incoming Starmer government. So the key features of Blair's revolution, if you want to sum it up in 3 bullet points, would be the de facto abolition of Parliament by dispersing its powers among the faceless, like-minded mandarins who fill what Michael Gove christened the Blob about 10 or so years ago. So
before becoming an inextricable member of it.
Indeed so, Connor, yes. And so you were thinking of things like Ofcom, things like English Nature, which hamstrings sort of environmental policy, the Migration Advisory Committee, which is responsible for the incredibly lax obviously, Boris Johnson's responsible, advisors advise and ministers decide, but Johnson, the Migration Advisory Committee put forward that very low salary threshold, which is means that we're now seeing record high levels of legal immigration.
Charity committee as well, which allows the Home Office to funnel hundreds of thousands of pounds to Hope Not Hate to smear people that notice problems.
Indeed, exactly. So you got yes, go on.
I was going to make the point that it really reinforces what you're trying to say here by the fact that as technology and the ability to govern more efficiently moves ahead. You've got computers and things. One would expect that you would need fewer and fewer people, fewer and fewer government bodies, because the role of government can be fulfilled with fewer and fewer people, because we need fewer people to, pass papers around and that sort of thing. And it's a very sort of perfunctory point that I think often gets overlooked, because the state has been expanding in its sort of purview consistently. There are more and more bodies advising other bodies, and it's become a sort of Cronenberg-esque monster of a bureaucracy. And the reality of the situation, the reality of what tools we have available to the state to actually govern, would suggest that it would be getting smaller, not bigger.
Yes, indeed. It's hilarious that their whole what they regard their right to rule as being legitimacy, being efficiency, and yet the civil service, just to take one point of contact, the civil service is 5 times larger than the Indian civil service was in sort of 1910 or something like that, and the Indian civil service did a much better job of it, I would argue, as well. So there's that aspect, there's kind of de facto abolition of Parliament. You've got the creation of a Supreme Court able to contradict the will of the people as expressed through their representatives, creating sort of rival sources of sovereignty in the realm of very. It makes sense to do that sort of thing when you're deliberately trying to create a new system, as the Americans were doing in 1787. That they needed a constitution, that this was a new nation. Separation of powers made sense in that context. When you're a long-established realm with a tradition of political stability, why would you want to tinker with that and potentially cause constitutional crises, which we've seen plenty of, not least during Brexit, paralysis, all that sort of thing. And of course, the most probably not the most lamentable of all, but one of the most predictable in advance. It was predictable in advance that this would go wrong, just stuffing the House of Lords with political cronies. I believe, who was the chap who wrote he wrote a wonderful, wonderful biography of Disraeli. Yeah, Lord Blake. He was himself a lord, and he wrote an article in, I think, the Times or the Telegraph, warning that the abolition of the hereditary peers was going to backfire massively, because unlike these political cronies, the hereditary peers, okay, it's a little bit antiquated. I will concede that, but they actually were tended to be younger, and they were much more independent because they owed their position to accidents of birth, and therefore often, not always, but often felt quite an instinctive sense of duty in the way that political cronies only really feel a duty to the people who planted them there. And so it just becomes this sclerotic, highly politicized chamber rather than an august one where duty rather than careerism reigns supreme.
The Lords has somewhat become a means of political parties rewarding their most loyal devotees in a way, isn't it? Because you've had lots of cases whereby there have been dodgy dealings whereby large donations have been given and then a year or two later a peerage is awarded.
Exactly. So it's just become an incredibly corrupt honour system, far worse than the kind of dodgy dealings which did go on, indeed, it must be said, in the 18th century. But anyway, so and to go into this in more detail, because this is actually not the main subject of my segment here, but if you want a detailed tour de force on Blair's revolution and the need to undo it, people should watch Dr. David Starkey's splendid speech. Connor and I were both there, in fact, at the recent New Culture Forum annual conference in Westminster. It's available on YouTube, and it's garnered a huge number of views and it got a lot of engagement. So, as I say, while the Conservative Party has spent the last 14 years obediently accommodating this new status quo, people like Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, now suspiciously close to Keir Starmer himself, have had plenty of time to plot ways to entrench it further and to kill off the traditional constitution of the United Kingdom, the sort of King, Lords and Commons, in a way which makes it, at the moment, it's impossible. It's very difficult. I think Carl Benjamin has actually said this before, either here or he might have said it when he came as a guest on the New Culture Forum. In fact, Blair's basic ambition, and Peter Hitchens has warned about this as well, and Starkey mentions it too, was effectively to make conservative politics, small c conservative politics, very, very difficult. If Keir Starmer succeeds, he may well make it impossible. And so we have this new 150-page report, ominously titled A New Britain, which I at any rate encourage people to leaf through, maybe not to read the whole thing. I'm not sure if Gordon Brown's prose particularly has much to recommend it. I doubt he wrote it himself, in fact, but it says he did. But there is a very helpful summary of the contents of what the new Labour under Keir Starmer has planned for Britain, which was put together by Jay Sorrell, which I believe that is actually, I don't know who he is. I think that might be a pseudonym, in fact, at Toby Young's The Daily Skeptic, and Sorrell zones in on two particular aspects of this intensification of the Blairite revolution that is likely to be on the horizon. So we've got the further subordination of Parliament to the judiciary, which will give birth to an increase in the kind of human rights radicalism that has hampered so much of our politics. So we even had the case, you know more about it than I do, Connor. What was that? It was an ECHR case.
Oh, what the boomers used Article 2 and Article 8 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, so that's the right to life and the right to a private family life, to argue that because global warming was increasing average temperatures, didn't provide evidence of that 4 elderly women, one of whom died during the proceedings of just old age, couldn't go on holiday, couldn't swim in their pool, couldn't go and sit on their balcony, and couldn't go outside without wearing a hat. Indeed. And therefore, this was a human rights violation that required all member states to take immediate and accelerated action on climate change. So it's too hot for the boomers to have a cruise, therefore indebt the entire next generation with windmills.
Indeed so. Yeah, no, that's a very fabulous, pithy summary of what went down there. And we saw recently a similar thing where I believe it was the Supreme Court in Britain, in fact, which I should have probably got a link to this, but people can look it up. The Supreme Court in Britain ruled that drilling for oil and well gas licenses in Surrey, there's now an obligation for all people engaged in such activities to take account of the effect they're having on the climate.
They have to. This is the Friends of the Earth case. They have to calculate the lifetime emissions released by the use of their product when it's out of their hands, not just during drilling. Because, of course, we don't have to calculate the lifetime emissions of importing it from overseas when it's done far less cleanly and far cheaper. Instead, we just have to actively destroy our own energy manufacturing capacity.
It is also worth mentioning to any Americans that are watching that the name Supreme Court is trying to steal some of the prestige of the US Supreme Court. I think that was deliberate by Blair, who's quite a canny sort of PR operator in the first place. But actually, it is, as you're alluding to, an avenue for judicial activism more so than the US Supreme Court, that I think is actually doing a rather good job as far as the other branches of government are concerned.
No, it is definitely true, Josh. I mean, all Supreme Courts and any human institution, in fact, there's always a risk that it can be politicized in a very overt way. But at the moment, the US Supreme Court, its reputation is holding up together much better than ours is.
Well, I think the reason is because the appointments are expressly political. Like the president himself, during his term, appoints the judges. Therefore, they know their partisanship, and you know that you have to live under the dictates of. Fortunately, at this point, one party is adherent to the Constitution and another party just hates the Constitution. So if the Republicans put someone in, at least you're going to get someone that's according to the spirit of America rather than just judicial activists. But over here, I don't actually know what the appointment process is for Supreme Court justices. But I know when I spoke to Liz in her book, when she was working in the Department for Justice, she made certain recommendations. I think she was the first female Lord Chancellor. And all of the other people that were meant to be advising her at the time that are much more senior said, no, we're not going to put that into effect because we're going to tell the judges to overrule you appoint our guy instead. Yes. So it's politicized, but it's the people that are doing the appointments have no direct accountability to the people they're meant to be ruling over.
Absolutely, but I also think the really crucial thing that makes our Supreme Court much more liable to be infiltrated by a kind of human rights radicalism, as Suella Braverman would want to call it, a kind of left-wing policy-making unit by the back door, so to speak, sort of bypassing the need to get it. The incredibly tedious business of having to get it through Parliament, all that sort of thing, is because the U.S. Supreme Court, which was set up in 1787, was deliberately set up as a kind of national Supreme Court, and there was an understanding that there was going to be this political process. All parties would have a hand in the people who got appointed to it. In the British case, because this was more of a political plot by New Labour, the Conservatives side of politics, and I mean that in a small c sense, was rather caught off guard. So whereas the US have had, US Republicans have had quite a long time, well, they were the Federalists back then, but mutated into the Republicans under Abraham Lincoln, they've had a lot of time to set up things like the Federalist Society, which deliberately try and get together good originalist judges who can do the conservative bidding on the Supreme Court. All of our appointees, which I believe there's some political oversight involved, but they're all creatures of that kind of New Labour revolution, because it was much more a political project by Blair rather than a national project at the initiation of the birth of a new nation. So that's concerned as well. And I'm just going to quote a passage from this excellent summary, which is much shorter than the 150 page document written by Gordon Brown, and
mercifully was also not written by Gordon Brown.
Mercifully not written by Gordon Brown. He's got a very neat, pithy style as well, this chap, Jay Sorrell, whoever he happens to be. So just to kind of make it more tangible and concrete to people, he writes the following. Consider small boats. Under the current system, a reforming government could solve the problem of illegal immigration tomorrow. It could legislate to make the Rwanda scheme legal, or leave the ECHR, or declare a state of emergency. This would require a simple majority in the House of Commons, or in extremis, the creation of several hundred new peers. With a new Britain, quote unquote, and judicial review, the issue will be taken entirely out of elected hands. Judges will simply enforce the principle that every human is entitled to live in a Western country. So at the moment, we're being hampered by the lack of a political will, and that's bad enough. In the future, it could be irrelevant. Even if there is a political will, it could be made totally irrelevant. You'd have to go through the incredibly exacting, laborious process of unentrenching entrenched constitutional rights, which redound to the interests of immigrants in this case, and redound against the interests of the host population that has already had its patience tested, I would argue, for 2 decades at this point. Another particularly alarming aspect of this doubling down on the Blairite revolution is going to be the enshrining of new social rights. Now, I don't know what our views are, gents, on I mean, rights language can be insidious enough politically, but when you're prefacing the word rights by social, you should always be concerned about what your political opponents might have planned for you. And so I'm going to actually quote from page 12 of, if we can go back to the Commission on the UK's Future, the original report Is that possible?
Yep. Just there we go.
There we go. If you go to page 12, which you don't need to, I can just read it. Gordon Brown or one of his spads or whoever it might be.
He had one eye on it at all times, I'm sure.
Now that is cruel. And maybe it's David Blunkett. There should be new constitutionally protected social rights, like the right to healthcare for all based on need, not ability to pay, that reflect the current shared understanding of the minimum standards and public services that a British citizen should be guaranteed.
That's an explicitly communist statement.
I was about to say exactly that, yeah.
That's healthcare communism. That's not from each according to his ability to pay. That's each according to his need to be serviced by some Nigerian we imported yesterday.
Indeed. And communism is bad enough when it's a political agenda. When it becomes an irreversible, constitutional, well, a very tough to reverse constitutional de jure system, it's even more insidious. I had to quote this sentence as well because I think it's the most alarming that I came across when I leafed through the 150-page document, and see if you can spot the insidious throwaway line to which I'm referring. This is on, well, I don't know the page number. So that no child, family, or elderly citizen need live in poverty, every person legitimately present in the UK shall be entitled to social assistance in relation to periods of unemployment, disability, or old age in accordance with the relevant laws. No person shall be left destitute.
So there's a constitutional right to 70% of Somalis getting social housing.
Indeed.
Another insidious aspect of that is the definition of poverty, because, of course, if you define poverty as it's currently defined in the UK as a certain percentage beneath the median, then poverty can never be eliminated and you'll always have a modus operandi for economic redistribution.
Yes, and that will just, yes, I hadn't thought about the definitions of poverty as well. And you will also, you would imagine as well that it will have an incredibly distorting effect on voting, because surely what you're going to get in that case is an even higher number of dependents in the political system. I mean, enterprising people are going to get the hell out of here, leaving you with a higher proportion of dependents in the population, whether foreign dependents or homegrown dependents, who I'm generally more sympathetic to.
It's a permanent clientele state.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, the other insidious part is legitimately present.
Yes.
Not legally present.
Yeah.
Legitimately. And who declares the legitimacy? He who does the constitutional revolution.
Indeed. If I can be very pompous for a second, sovereign is wer über den Ausnahmezustand entscheidet. That means sovereign is he who decides the state of exception. I think these people are going to be deciding what counts as legitimately.
He quotes Schmidt in the original German. Blind.
I was going to say the same thing, except not in the original German.
Sorry, I couldn't help myself. As soon as Connor brought that up, I knew what he was alluding to. And we're also, so immigrants will receive a constitutionally entrenched right to be subsidized at our expense, fundamentally. And if that isn't rich enough when it comes to, a kind of pathologically altruistic xenophilia and a kind of, studied contempt for your own people and your own duties to them, we're also staring down the barrel of a further clampdown on free speech to protect, as ever, we saw, talk of Hindu-phobia earlier. Well, Hindu-phobia is still on the rise as a concept. Islamophobia has been entrenched for quite a while, and it may now be on the verge of being entrenched in law. So we're going to go to, I should probably say as well, before we go to our now mutual boss at the New Culture Forum, Peter Whittle, I think a lot of this has to do with the Starmer's flirtation, at any rate, with the concept of potentially a new blasphemy law designed to protect Muslims from having their feelings trampled upon.
When you just quote hadith verses that make them look bad.
Yes, gosh, that could be an optics nightmare. I think this has a large part to do with the fact that Starmer, precisely because he's cautious to just distance himself from the Corbyn legacy, has been very muted on Israel-Gaza. He's not. He seems to have lent, as most politicians in the Western world have done, moral and diplomatic support to Israel in the war to avenge the grotesque attacks that happened on the 7th of October. And I think it's partly as a way of trying to limit the hemorrhaging of the Muslim vote which is again an important clientele class for a Labour Party which long ago ditched solidarity with the working classes for the politics of minoritarian grievance. The meaning of Islamophobia will be further watered down and then altogether criminalized. So Peter Whittle, my boss at the New Culture Forum, now mutual boss with Connor, has put out a very important video recently warning us to prepare for Starmer's very censorious plans. And if we could just play the first minute of it.
Yes, absolutely.
Hello, I'm Peter Whittle. Now, if you've been following the election, you might have seen this Labour Party video. If not, then take a look at this cosy chat between Keir Starmer and the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan.
One of the things that is coming up over and over again is Islamophobia. And, well, you can see the stats, you can see the numbers rising, particularly since October the 7th. Although we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that before October the 7th, this was all heading in the right direction. It's been far too high for far too long. Clearly, we need to just say over and over again, Islamophobia is intolerable. It can never, ever be justified. And we have to continue with a zero tolerance approach. And I think there's more we can do in government. There's certainly stuff online which I think needs tackling much more robustly than it is at the moment.
What I'm hoping, Keir, is your experience as a prosecutor means you'll be thinking about the strategy we can use to make sure we take action against those who break the law.
Now, despite...
Why is he dressed like Cunley Druckper's Rubber Dinghy Rapids, Britain, Islam? Sorry, I just had to note that.
Who's the independent journalist?
Yes, yeah. My favourite Rwandan ambassador.
The funny thing is, I agreed with everything Keir Starmer said, except about the term Islamophobia. So he made it sound as if, well, you know, Islamophobia is this pervasive thing, but it's the use of the term to silence legitimate criticism of Islam, which there are many.
No, to say the least, Josh. And also, as well, I think the other thing that I'm always keen to point out to people, because, you know, despite my objections to Islam as a set of religious dogmas, and my objection to the Islamization of my own country, not least as a Christian, quite apart from all that, I don't want to see, you know, Muslim businesses subjected to a kind of anti-Muslim kristallnacht of any kind. But the one thing that I always do find puzzling when Islamophobia is put on a pedestal with anti-Semitism, and I would want to put in anti-white rhetoric in this country as well, when it's sort of put on an equal playing field with anti-Semitism. Does Islam strike you as a particularly cowed political force in this country? I mean, just to give you one point of contact with us, how many Jewish people do you know who engage in acts of public prayer, let alone in London?
None, and a lot of synagogues have security.
Indeed, and I think we have a Reuters article next up, which shows that the UK government has made a conscious point of increasing security funding for Jewish people.
They probably should have done that as well to the white working class girls in various towns across Britain that were subjected to, I don't know, I suppose you could call the grooming gangs an Islamic hate crime.
That might have been a reasonable use of government funds. No, certainly that's true. But it goes to show that if we're going to engage in conversations about what is more serious, and I would agree with you, that's why I wanted to put anti-white in, because I think it's far too popular to object to the Islamization of Europe or to object to mass demographic transformation of our countries. But we need to do it in polite liberal terms. So we need to say that we're doing it for the Jews, we're doing it for women, we're doing it for gays. I would also want to put it in, and for the majority population, which doesn't want to see this happen to them either. But nevertheless, it goes to show that if it's being put, which is routinely put on a sort of equated with anti-Semitism, Islam seems to me to be an emboldened force in this country. It's flexing its muscles. It's intimidating MPs into resigning. It's completely distorting parliamentary procedure. We saw that with Sir Lindsay Hoyle. So it doesn't strike me as particularly bashful. And so that's just one common sense point of contact with what's really going on the ground.
Yeah, modesty, not among the pantheon of Islamic virtues, is it?
Certainly not.
Well, immediately again, after October the 7th happened, those prayers outside Downing Street were not in solidarity.
Yes.
They were not for the victims. They were not for any Palestinians who had yet been killed in the crossfire, because the retaliation hadn't started yet. They were prayers of victory.
Indeed.
So that is to be remembered.
Indeed.
It is also worth bearing in mind a game I like to play sometimes when people question the violent nature of Islam. I say, here is my copy of the Quran. I'm going to open it at random, and you will find on any page a call to violence.
Yes. Yeah.
And every time I've done it, every single time, I've always been able to find it.
Yeah, no, it's again, they're not bashful about hiding that either. So I thought we'd look into a bit of Whittle's own analysis of this, because he quotes from a definition that is going to be used by Keir Starmer in drafting up what seems likely to be legislation. I mean, it was quite ambiguous there. Starmer was, in some senses, it was ambiguous. I mean, the political motivation was not at all ambiguous, but there was talk of we need to tackle that online. And I suspect that we, as online, given our online presence, whether it's through Lotus or whether it's through the New Cultural Forum and the European Conservative and other places, we might be victims of a kind of expansion of Ofcom's remit. That seems perfectly plausible to be a perfectly plausible outcome.
And they'll outsource the enforcement to various state-sponsored quangos like Hope Not Hate, and obviously the definition was formulated by the all-party parliamentary group on Islamophobia, but they have various underlings, various Islamic advocacy organizations that are also, ironically, against the Labour Party, tied into the Muslim vote initiative.
Yes, they need not even introduce any new infrastructure to do this sort of thing. They can just use Section 127 of the Communications Act and use the politicisation of the police, which, has been going on for quite some time now.
That was under Thatcher from the public order bills.
Yeah, to just encourage the police to go after this more often.
So it might not even require new legislation. They could just draw on existing legislation in a very overt fashion. So there's that aspect to it. But then the thing that made me think that rather than just use of existing legislation and expanding Ofcom's remit and dispersing yet more power to these to the NGOocracy, as I think some people like to call it. I found it very, very alarming there when Sadiq Khan saying, "Oh, and you've of course got your legal background as well, don't you, Zakir? So you have a background in sort of tackling this sort of stuff." This is going to be legislative in my view, and the legislative form it will take is here quoted by Peter Whittle.
Is an invented word which has been used time and again to stifle argument and valid opinion. But this new definition widens it to such an extent that all debate or discussion on a whole range of enormously important issues will be effectively shut down. The definition was agreed by an all-parliamentary party group and reads thus, quote, "Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness."
Thoughts?
Gibberish, isn't it? Muslimness.
What is a Muslim? Isn't that
race.
Matt Walsh's next documentary?
Yeah, what is a Muslim? We might need it.
Yeah,
we might need it. Some conceptual clarification sake. Do you have something to say?
Yeah, I don't remember the race of Islam. I believe it's a theological doctrine in which anyone from anywhere can sign up to.
But you can't easily quit it.
Yeah, that's true. You can't have second thoughts, but yeah, the racial element is just capitalising on the prevailing wind, isn't it? It's trying to make it sound all the more egregious that it's merely racist rather than being prejudiced against a particular religious belief, which actually is seen as far more acceptable in this current day.
And as G.K. Chesterton warns us as well, evil always takes advantage of ambiguity. When we have a case study of ambiguity there, so it seems like a further part of Keir Starmer's brewing revolution will be, we will see that sort of the passage of a de facto blasphemy law which exists in the United Kingdom already. Has anyone checked in on the teacher at Batley Grammar School lately? I mean, he is suffering from the existence of a sort of de facto blasphemy law becoming an insidious de jure one, that it favours this new Muslim clientele class, this growing Muslim clientele class in British politics, and counts yet again against the host population that has already been subjected to a reckless demographic experiment. So when we have a political class that not only imports foreign, often hostile dependents, but then presumes to forbid us from criticizing them. So fair warning, after the election, we need to be ready for a two-front war, in my view. One for the soul of the right, and we've spoken about that in Connor's segment in particular, but the other, probably more difficult, against the escalated belligerence of a slick, motivated, highly well-organized left.
Hi folks, thanks for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can go to lotus.com for £5 a month and sign up and watch Bo's amazing Epoch series. Bo is, of course, a historian, and he does hours and hours and hours of long-form history content, such as this one on Captain James Cook. These are things he tends to cover subjects that are actually slightly outside of normal, popular histories. So you get to learn about things that are very interesting that you otherwise may well have missed.